Blackmagic is
Oh,
rolling.
you know what, I'm gonna send the slate signal down to you, so
Okay,
I'm
go
gonna re-roll
ahead.
sound.
Go ahead.
Alright, rolling sound on A camera, and A camera is recording.
B camera's rolling and the Blackmagic is rolling. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
and bring the slate in a little bit there, Carrie, okay? And slate it.
George Coker interview, take one.
Alright. So George, you and I will just be having a conversation. You can look at me, you don't need to worry about the cameras, just let them go. Occasionally I'll need to refer to my notes, so please forgive me if I look down and have to refer to things. First thing I want to do is thank you and Pam for participating, and this is, your stories are extraordinary. And I can only express my deep regret for what you went through for our country and for all of us. So thank you, sir. As I talked to you about in your home the other day, what makes this project unique is that the audience for this is the military. They want to learn from the crucible of leadership and brotherhood and bonding and work that all of you did in this experience. Because future warriors, future leaders may find themselves in similar or perhaps very different, but the fundamental of that experience, apply to all kinds of aspects of all kinds of situations. So my questions will be geared more in that area, what we can learn from you for military leaders of tomorrow. Let's start off with just, if you would, sir, state your name, your rank at retirement, and your area of service, that you were part of the Navy.
Well, my name is George Coker, and I retired in '86 as a Navy commander. I got into aviation early on, and that's what I did up through my shoot down. And actually, after return, I stayed in aviation. Got into A6 squadrons, which what I shot down in, and it was flying all the way up until 1980 when I went to a desk job, I guess. Went to DC, later to commanded the command center at Norfolk, and a tour in the Nimitz as strike ops officer.
Great.
So,
I'm going to just double check everything. I just want to make sure that I am, yes, in fact, recording. Yes, I am. Okay. Talk to me a little bit about the circumstances of your shoot down, what led up to it a little bit, kind of a brief overview of what brought you to your circumstances as a prisoner in North Vietnam.
well, the schedule was pretty set routine. It was my 55th mission. Jack Fellows was my pilot. Like I say, it was sort of what you might call a milk run, if you can call flying in combat a milk run. Took off about midday, going out to hit the infamous Thin Hoa Bridge. And it so happens as we started to climb, which you come in at relatively low level, 4,000 feet, and you climb up to 8 or 10 to roll in for a bombing run. And supposedly we were hit in the process of doing all this with the SAM missile, which was a point of disagreement, so to speak, because we never heard anything on our system indicate that a SAM was lighting us up. And the other plane that was with us, there were two A6, they never heard anything. And when they got back, that was one of the things they specifically checked of the aircraft, that all the gear is working. So if it was a SAM missile, it was one heck of a lucky visual shot, which is extremely improbable. Much more likely we were shot by 85 millimeter. But at all events, whatever happened, it blew the wing off the airplane. And the airplane went into extremely violent, erratic moves. And it was kind of rolling its back and turning in, and Jack punched out. I realized that the pilot had left the airplane, that perhaps the BN should too, so I left the airplane. I was only in the chute not even 30 seconds. By the time the plane was going down, we weren't that high when we ejected. I was caught immediately when I touched down. I came down like in the middle of a rice paddy where people were working, and they grabbed my arms literally as as soon as I landed, I reached up to undo my parachute and my hands would pull back. So that began my captivity right there. It took 10 to 15 minutes for me to get Jack. He kind of landed over a little hill. But they dragged us back to a hooch and notified the military, whatever, that they had captured some people, and that began the long trek to Hanoi and the years that followed.
Thank you, sir. The military code of conduct states certain stipulations on someone shot down or captured. And one of the important things that all of you pioneered and in many ways led by CAG was you had to adapt your understanding of that requirement to the realities, the harsh realities on the ground. Can you speak to me about that, please?
Well, I suppose you had to adapt somewhat, but I'm not so sure the adapting was that terrible. Is the problem with there is no easy answer to it. So basically, I thought we followed the code of conduct pretty much. I mean, no matter what you do, if they want to beat the living daylights out of you, there's nothing that you can say, do, or that can change that. Neither is anything written down on a piece of paper going to change that. Maybe we adapt in terms that if you're really getting the daylights beat out of you for meaningless information or input, maybe give and take a little bit. So, okay, that's adapting. If somebody, I think the big thing is not so much that we had to reinterpret it. Some people might interpret it in a very radical manner. You must do this no matter what. Well, that could be suicide. So I'd say a little common sense was put on top of it, but I'm one who thought that the code of conduct was a mighty good guideline.
Great.
And yeah, you had to flex a little bit, but to come in and, when we got done, I had I was on a review board that the Pentagon ran. I saw no reason to change anything. So I'm sure you can get numerous different answers or attitudes about that question.
Yes, sir. One of the things that CAG did face, because what you find out is that different people have different measures of pain, different, and everything else. And one of the most pernicious things that would happen is if someone was forced under the duress of torture to give more than name, rank, serial number, date of birth. The truth is, the Vietnamese were unlikely after intel. Pilots by design have 7 days of intel max. At that point, your strategic importance had more to do with their propaganda machine, is my understanding, than intel, and yet they persisted. And for a lot of your fellow POWs who at some point in torture gave up more than name, rank, and serial number, as one described to me, he lay in his cell for a year and a half, unwilling to accept any communication from those trying to get him the tap code or anything else. He felt he had betrayed his country, and that when he got out, he could not even return to the United States. And it was a very important moment when he was reached by his fellow POWs who expressed, listen, we're all in this together. We're going to go fight tomorrow again. We've all given in somewhere or another. And can you speak about that? Did you see that happening?
I'm not sure I'm aware of that extreme situation you're talking about. I'm kind of think maybe I do, but I'm not sure. But that general situation certainly existed. And even going back to the previous question about, did you have to adapt? When you're facing torture, and particularly if you've been at least pretty well abused before, if not full-fledged torture, you're trying to figure out any way you can rationalize that might get you out of it. And the funny thing, in the end, you have nothing to do with it. Whether or not you get tortured is their action, not yours. So that's when you say you adapt. Well, you don't do it if it's for this reason or if it's for that reason. Then you get somebody that feels if you say anything, it's all over. You do the best you can, and what they even call it later, spring back. And that was a big thing. You may give up, you may kind of roll over 3, 4, 5 times, but the thing that you keep coming back. You can't roll over the 5th time if you haven't sprung back from the fourth. You can't roll over on the fourth that you hadn't sprung back from the third. And that to us was the secret, because it says some people could maybe endure more. Maybe they had even stronger motivation, like this one guy, not to do it no matter what. But then when it happens, the big thing is, okay, pick yourself up. You got the next play to run, spring back. And as long as you kept springing back, couldn't ask for any more than that.
That is outstanding, sir. I know that Commander Stockdale at the time, Admiral Stockdale, at one point in his command planning and everything else, he realized that my understanding is he tapped through the walls, you know, if you have to give something up, you go to the point of permanent physical injury, give something up, and then come back and fight again the next day. Do you remember when that change happened? Or maybe that's not a change, maybe that's within the confines of the code, but I understood it as him needing to take his guys, those under his command, and temper things in some way to help them fight back the next day.
I'm trying to think. I do remember it, and now I just have to recall that memory of him putting out that word. I mean, there's several policies that went out from the seniors when they were available, and that was one of them. I say that came out before Alcatraz, so it would be probably the big purge they had at what you call the Hanoi Hilton in '67, summer of '67. But yeah, what do you tell the do? You get that radical that you have to do it no matter what. But like I say, that doesn't leave you an exit strategy if you don't have, if you want to call it, you got to adapt a little bit. But what do you tell a guy to get the living daylights torched out of you? Don't say anything. Oh, that's easy. Right. That just isn't the way to do it. So yeah, I would say if you want to call it adapt a little bit, flex a little bit. I think mainly he just realized the import. The part you don't read into that is not so much escape, getting away from it, is the fact is saying, unless it, you know, you really got to fight back. You don't roll over this way because you're afraid. So when he said, hey, you get tortured to the point of permanent disability or something like that, okay, then finally give him a little something to make it go away. But what he's saying right there, what this guy has already done, what he's also implying is, you got to go that far before you can make that decision. And there were a lot of people who were looking at, caveat a lot, who didn't want to go that far. So that was really a two-edged sword. And you can always read it one way, assuming the other. There were two parts to that policy. And part of it is, first you got to resist hard, but then there's limits.
Is that, can you, if you were able, if you were given the chance, which you actually are right now, to give advice to future leaders in the Navy regarding this very subject, what it takes to navigate resistance and at the same time strategically navigate that resistance, because that's really what you're talking about here. There was a strategy to, even when you had to acquiesce under pain to something, there was a strategy within that. And you know, young leaders of today coming up, 19-year-olds who are raised on video games and everything else, may or may not grasp the importance of, like, where are the lessons in that for a young leader in training today?
Well, the first part of that is a very simple answer, which was what that policies were really saying when you, like say, when you look at it the way I was just telling you. It's telling you fight like hell to the best of your ability. And then when you're shot or you're injured or you're suffering, you can't do anymore, you back off enough to recoup your strength and you do it again. You got to spring back, even when you don't want to, even though when you're going to be, so to speak, destroyed or beat down again. But you got to keep on. The strategy is to continue to fight until the bitter end, which they can kill you or you ultimately win. But that's it. There's no easy way out of it. The strategy is to win. In our case, winning was just continuing to fight. Don't give up, don't quit.
That's one of the things that stands out in the history and annals of the American POWs there in the Hanoi systems. resilience, this battle behind bars that was fought every single day. And you exemplified that, sir. Everything I've read about you. Paul Galante jokes that in the end he thinks the Vietnamese released him to get you out of the country. Pam's smiling at that.
Paul has said that in front of me on occasion.
He has. One of the stipulations of the code of conduct is that if you are captured and held as prisoner, you should try to escape. You're one of the only two people who ever managed to escape for a period of time. And your story about that is absolutely fascinating. And if you would, sir, somewhere between the 2-minute and the 2-hour version, if you could tell that story.
Well, in one respect, you might call it escape of opportunity. In another way, a very brilliantly conceived and developed plan that took us only a week because we were such geniuses. The big thing is a huge purge was going on at what, again, you call the Hanoi Hilton. George had been, this is George McKnight, had been extensively tortured. And then they took him out to this place that we ended up calling the Dirty Bird. It was the old power plant, the living quarters, I would call it, for the old power plant. So it was still functioning. Been bombed, damaged, was back up and operating. Not too many people out there. We don't know for sure who all went out there or why or how long they stayed. I got caught up in the same purge in August and got the daylights torched out of me. And I ended up going out to the Dirty Bird. So late September, we both were out there in the Dirty Bird area, and actually it was George who during nap time picked his handcuffs, because what they did to us today is handcuffed an ankle to one of our wrists across way. He had picked the cuffs, and he found me. And said, you know, just so we could communicate, because at this point we're totally isolated. So we kind of every afternoon during the siesta time, the guards made a pass. We'd unpick our handcuffs, stand up, and we could talk from a distance quietly. And a lot of things just came together, you know. Dumb luck beats skill and cunning every time. But for some idiotic reason, they had tried to parade George out front where people could see him. Wild speculation on our part is they did it deliberately so word would get back to the U.S. unofficially. The POWs are right there next to the power plant. You shouldn't bomb it. Who knows? But often they claim he had to walk the cow around the local block or two. But what that enabled him to find out, which nobody ever knew, for the 7 or 8 years there, nobody knew what it was like on the other side of the wall. George did for the first time and only time. By walking around, he knew the layout of that immediate area. He could say, hey, if something was going to happen, you wouldn't go that way, you'd go this way. So he knew the local area. And from that, he also saw some structures, including the top of a bridge. And I asked him to describe it to me. And he very carefully answered, George, be very specific. Stop and think. If you don't know for sure, don't say, but tell me exactly what you remember. And he told me some stuff about the appearance of the structure, the curved girders, and I knew that was the Domer Bridge because it had been a target. And I knew the area, I knew where it was, I knew that was the bridge. So now the second thing that came that, again, it had never happened and never did happen was we knew where we were. So now we know where we are, which was unique for the situation, and we also knew what the immediate surrounding area was, which was extremely unique for the situation. Getting out was something people could always think about, work on. That was not necessarily impossible from other places, but I mean, what do you do next? All we needed is to get out, because then we knew what the place was like and where to go. And because the place had been bombed, there's a lot of trash and junk, pieces of metal laying around. We were able to use some of that stuff to start working away at the lock, the locking mechanism that held the door locked when we were inside the room. And slowly over the next few days, we worked at digging that out. And it's kind of complicated without graphics and stuff, but basically we were able to loosen up some mechanism inside whereby we could just simply pull the door away from the lock, or the apparatus that held the lock. And the secret would be then to push it back together and lock it in place. Well, while we were in the room, we could lock it in place by putting a wedge into it. And that was part of the game plan for when we escaped that night, is how would we manage to wedge it when we're on the outside. Now we can't wedge it from the inside. And we ginned up a couple of Rube Goldberg's way to do that. But that's how we had set it up. I knew I had the big scheme, so to speak. I knew that if we could get to the river, we could go downriver to the delta, steal a small fishing sailing boat, and head for the area that the carriers operated in, which then you'd be easily fine with the airplanes coming in. So that was my grand scheme. George knew how to get out of the immediate 2 or 3 block area. And that was very important because of all the ways we end up going out of this little complex of housing units, the way we went would have been my absolute last choice because I didn't know any better. But he had been able to see where everything was. And it was one of those classic things. Yeah, well, we're going to go 100 yards this way because that enables us to make this little 2 feet step up. And then we're going to come back that 200 yards and go another 200 yards that way. But there was no other way to make that little short step except to go down there first, all the way back to a coal pile that, again, he knew it was there. That was a way to get down off this very high wall as we slid down the coal. Climbed over
Tell
fence.
the story of a search for contraband in your quarters.
Oh, well, that kicked off the actual date. A standard procedure there, usually once a week, no set schedule, but more or less like that. They would come in and tear your place apart, inspecting your place, looking for anything you're not supposed to have, which is next to nothing. And we were always prepared for that. All the stuff that used to work and the stuff, the doors, we'd bring it in at night. So in the daytime, first time they took us out, that went out. We didn't leave stuff in the room. And lo and behold, we'd been working this stuff now for about a week. And they pulled an inspection, which actually really didn't surprise us. But at this stage, though, we had completely done all the work on the door locking mechanism. And it would have taken nothing to open the door without unlocking it, and it would have been taken no brilliance or effort or energy to look down and see there's been major construction on the inside of the door. But the door was such that it was in the corner of the room, it opened in, and when it opened in, it went straight against the wall. A lot of bathrooms might be like that, where you open the door and it goes flat against the wall. There's no space between it all. I mean, you couldn't put a broom back there. They came in and swung the door open, and both of our rooms, same way, tore the place apart, found nothing, there was nothing to find. But they never looked behind the door. If the door had been in the middle of the room, you naturally would have been looking around it or something because of things on the other side of it. In this case, it was right against the wall on the hinge, and they just never had any reason to look behind it. And if they had, they would have seen what was going on, and the Great Escape would never have started. But just that quirk, and I'm standing there as they're doing this, just, I don't know if you even can see the kind of emotions or tensions going through you, just knowing that you're a hairbreadth from destruction. And they finished tearing the place up, they pulled the door closed and locked it. And they did the same thing in George's room. So that afternoon we went out, we got communication, George, we can't take this chance again. We got to get the hell out of here where we can. So we didn't go that night, but we set up for the following night. And that's what we did. And like I say, thanks to George, we know how to get out of the immediate area. And once headed toward the river, we were about, all total, half a mile, a little less from the river itself. We had to get to the river, and then in the river, swim downstream. And I guess a detail that's very important telling the story is not so much because it's important to the escape, it certainly was important to the suffering we took afterwards. I had expected at least a 2-knot, closer to hopefully a 4-knot or more current, and I would say when we got there it was right about 3 knots. So when we swam downstream 15 miles, yes, you got to be able to stay underwater for 5 hours, yes, you got to know how to swim, but it's not the same thing as being an Olympian swimming for 15 miles. You're doing a side stroke or a breaststroke and just basically kind of keep it up and going with the current. And we went out about 10 o'clock at night when we left the rooms. We got to the river because there's a devious route to get there. I'd say we're in the river by midnight. sun broke very quickly around 5 o'clock, I'd guess maybe 5:30. So we were in the river swimming for about 5 hours. But yes, we did go about 15 miles, which we could confirm later when we got back from where we went in, which is the northwest corner of Hanoi. Had to go all the way to Hanoi, and then we got out into the countryside. I'd say about 5 miles, 5 or 6 miles. Were captured strictly by accident. We suddenly dug a hole into the side of the cliff. The cliffs were about 10 feet high. The banks of the river. Think of any muddy, fast-flowing river in any country you know about. We dug into it, and the only place you could see us if you stood all the way out on the edge of the bank, right above us and looked straight down. If you're 2 feet, 3 feet to the left or right, you wouldn't have had an angle to see us. If you're back away from the cliff, a foot, even 18 inches, you wouldn't have had an angle to see us. You had to stop right there. And I'd be darned if a little old fishing guy with a cane pole didn't have to stop right there. And even then, he didn't know where he flipped his cane pole out in action. And obviously, it goes down to the water. He looked down toward it. And there were these two white guys that did not look like they were Vietnamese. And that was the end of the Great Escape. I mentioned the 50 miles because that was the biggest thing we suffered for when we got back. I mean, they were mad. They beat the living daylights out of us. They dragged us out there, I think, to let everybody know that, in fact, we'd been recaptured because all hell broke loose, apparently, when they couldn't find us the next morning. But one of the biggest things they couldn't comprehend is us getting downstream 15 miles. And they basically couldn't believe it. It was beyond their comprehension, so they wouldn't believe it. So we got beat up really bad numerous times over that single issue. We told them exactly what we did. They just couldn't comprehend it, so they didn't believe us.
And the irony was that you were sort of infamous. When they would compare notes after each session, they'd realize what you told them yesterday, you told them an entirely different thing today. You were a master at lying and deceiving them and redirecting them. But this is the one time when you tell the truth. And
they didn't believe me. Well, I guess, well, except George was telling the same thing now. You know, I wasn't by myself, that's true. I never told him the same story twice. I'm definitely at odds with that dictum that you have to have this special personality, have to remember. And I said, no, tell them stuff so they know they will never find anything out from you that they can't verify. Because I'll tell them anything. But that one time, and that was early before my line was well established, George is backing up, but they just wouldn't accept it.
And when were you first introduced? Obviously, in any situation of duress and of military endeavor, establishing lines of communications is essential, and it's one of the things that was a lifeblood for all of you in the Hanoi prison systems. When did you first encounter the TAP code, and how did that come about?
Well, it's firstly the same day or the next day that I got to the Hanoi Hilton. We call it Heartbreak Hotel, HBH. It took them about 2 weeks to drag Jack and I up from relatively down south in the Panhandle all the way up to north. All the bridges had been bombed out. So it took quite a while for them to get us there. But once we got there, we went into the 8-cell room of Heartbreak Hotel. And I would say within hours, I heard tapping on the wall. And in the meantime, I'd sitting around, and everyone, no matter, there were 2 concrete pads, bunks if you want to call them that, with stocks at the end. And no matter which end of the 4 spots you could sit, you know, if I just sat like this at the end of the bed, just right there was a 5x5 matrix of letters. That's interesting. I happen to sit over there on the other side. There's a 5x5 on all 4 corners. If you sit there and look toward the wall, there is a 5x5 matrix of letters. Unlike a Marine, my mind moved a little bit swifter. And I said, geez, what's going on? I started hearing this tapping. And it was in sequence, you know, broken sequence. I said, I'd be damned. I think they're tapping a matrix. The only thing is, I went across and down instead of down and across. So the guy's tapping to me and I'm not following him. It's not making sense. I'm trying to figure that out. And all of a sudden he figures after 30 seconds that I haven't picked up on it. So he goes a long way, which is you tap, if you have to, you tap 26 letters, alphabet, get that idea in your head. Then you tap a long letter just for HI, for high. Then you go back and try to transfer it to the tap code, and it works out. You finally figure it out, unless you're a Marine. So I was really into the tap code the first day I was in Heartbreak Hotel. It happened that quick. It turned out being Ty, the Vietnamese pilot who had been captured, that was tapping to me. So there you go.
And as circumstances develop there, did the tap code come to take more and more meaning for you?
Well, and since it became the only means of communication, yeah, I mean, it was a life string. I would say, give me a 12 or 13 or 14-year-old girl, let me take her iPhone, what would the effect be? I would say us losing the tap code would have been even more dramatic because it was the only means of communication. At least you might have to figure out how to say hello and use your regular phone, even if she was going nuts without having the iPhone and texting. But without that, at least where I was most time, there'd have been no communication at all. So that was really your lifeline to the other POWs.
And the Americans had a way, obviously, if they're displaying this grid in the cell, they know the guards can see it, but there were ways in which you were always really reassured that a guard couldn't be tapping to you, trying to entrap you.
Yeah, that sometimes the simplest things are the hardest to understand. There are a couple things. One, you had to sign on, and believe it or not, you sign on certain ways, and it sounds a certain way. It's not automatic, although that could be jimmied a little bit. But then you start tapping, and we had an awful lot of abbreviations. I've heard some of the guys, we laugh at the younger generation. You got all these little abbreviations and shortcuts. We were doing that 50 years ago, because literally almost every letter in the alphabet had its own distinct meaning, and there are so many two-letter words or meanings that, I mean, you could go like crazy.
Could you give me some examples of those?
Well, were could be WR, could be were or we're. There is usually TR. D is usually just a plain T. O could be 0, or you could double up instead of tapping 2, because that was 3, 4, you could tap 1, 2. So which is easy to tap. And this gets all mixed in and meshed. Our names, my name was C. All the guys that had one letter names, so to speak. You say, well, that's obvious. Well, sometimes, depending on how many letters you got, some people end up with some strange letters for the name. I think Sam Johnson was L, but mine was C. The letter B is the word BE. To see somebody was the letter C. We didn't go SCE. D usually automatically mean do or did. So again, a little bit would be going in context, but this stuff just came. N was and, A-N-D. That was one of the funniest things with Jerry. It's the only thing, and I know Jerry in a heartbeat. Anybody could tap to me all day long, and I would know if it was Jerry if he tapped the word A-N-D to me, because it was in, 3-3. But it was never divided. It was a rhythm of 6. And it just sounded a certain way. I knew that was 3-3 for the letter N, which meant A and D, but nobody ever tapped it that way except Jerry didn't. So if I had to tap with somebody and you wanted to know to absolutely guarantee if you said you Jerry didn't, I knew you could not prove it unless Jerry tapped. Just one of those quirks. But that's where it went. In that respect, it kind of was like Morse code. But you could go down almost letter after letter, how it could be mean, particularly as you put it in context. But then the devastating thing about trying to copy it, whereas we really couldn't copy each other, is that as you were tapping, as soon as you recognized the word, you would go tap, tap. So if I want to say, joking around and saying 7 years ago, well, if you put down 4 and you started scores, you'd get SC and I'd go tap tap. And 3-3 for A and D. And 4 square, and 7 SCV tap tap. Because now I know where he's going. Unless he's going to change it, as long as he'll stop one letter, I'll go tap tap. If it's following my sequence. So somebody else listening to it hears score, SC, 3-4-1-3, then all of a sudden 2-2 coming there. Well, he thinks 2-2 is the beginning of the next letter, and here the score is going on to the next thing. And it just gets all jumbled up because every time you think you got it figured out, this strange 2-2 pops in there. As well as, are you picking up on it as quick as I am? Now, if you are faster than me, that's very easy. But if I'm faster than you, I'm progressing right down this thing, cutting them off and moving along, and you don't know what the hell's going on. So really, it's an extremely secure system of tapping. And the 1 or 2 times that somebody tried to tapping a distance is not a big deal, but tapping where 2 people were listening, it was extremely awkward and cumbersome, and they had to have an agreement that the one would never cut off. Because as soon as you threw something in like that, it just became a jumble.
So there was an agreement that one would never do the double tap saying, I got that.
Yeah, because if you did that, you have no idea who's talking. Like you're at a distance, but that's one thing. Sound's carrying through a wall, but once it hits that wall over there, it could come from upstairs, it can come downstairs, it could be from 50 feet down. It's very difficult. I mean, like if you knew you were in the middle, maybe you could ascertain, but even in the middle, if the wall, the noise, the vibrations are coming down the wall, you don't know which direction it's coming from. So a really fast tapper might be able to sort of interpret or listen in on some other pair of POWs. Gook never could. Never could. I don't care how well he spoke English, how well he knew the tap code. They could even record it and wouldn't be able to figure it out after the fact. So like I said, very simple, very plain, very secure, even though they knew it the whole time. Couldn't do it.
And at a certain point, probably what began as taps on the walls then took on new dimensions. Jim Mulligan talks about it the day he was listening and he started to hear someone chopping wood outside. Can you talk about the ways that communication network extended?
Anything that made noise or shadows could be used as STEM tap code. Because you always say tap code, but it's really a sequence of signals like G, did it, 2-2. If I'm squeaking, I can G. Who is this out here? George. Oh, E. Just making noise sweeping, you can do that. Or as they came up with cough, they came up with the, for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think like a cough, a hack, a spit, something like that. I forget one. In fact, it was Jerry Ditton that came up with it. So that you could, which was used quasi-emergently. If you got dragged out at night and we didn't know what was going on, at least you could let them know who was going. Because all I had to get out was a C, They knew Coker was the one that's being hauled out. And the hack and cough and stuff down there, particularly in the wintertime, that would have been commonplace. The guards are doing the same thing. But the same effect, which we never had the opportunity to use, but a lot of the other places did, which the thing about the noise, it can go long distance. I could be tapping here, but now I'm not tied to a wall or a cup listening. That could be going over 50, 60, 70 feet away. Was the flash code, which worked the same way. I mean, if you got a, matter of fact, that's how Stockdale always communicated with Tanner, linking the Alcatraz people, is shadow code, 1, 2, 1, 2, G, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. And that could be seen sometimes at a pretty large distance. So again, if you can break it up, unlike Morse code, which required timing, the tap code didn't. There was no speed. It was strictly a counting system, so to speak. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that the sweeping, the noise, the shadows enable us to extend the range of the communication. But what Mulligan was saying is it was everywhere. If you were doing anything, you could be communicating.
And
Shu always did. Shu had the by the way, just to make sure this is very serious stuff we're talking about right now. Shu invariably had to clean up the latrine after we all dumped our buckets in the morning, so that was his up that was swishing away. Shu remembered everybody's happy birthday George, a happy birthday Jim, or anniversaries, or shoot down dates. He had all those dates down, and almost every morning he had a happy birthday or happy anniversary or something to somebody as he was cleaning up the latrine.
And what did that mean to morale? That kind of like Phil Butler makes a point that having a sense of humor was key in some ways. Like these little moments, like to hear "Happy Birthday." I mean, you talk about the bond of brotherhood that you experienced.
That was it. It was a bond. It was a bonding element. You had a little bit of humor involved as well. A well-wishing. Somebody cares about you. You care back. You know, if you had the chance, or if and when you get the chance, you will return the favor, so to speak, saying something nice, or even after he sends that, invariably something would come down the wall from the so-called recipient sending back a thank you. So yeah, like I say, when I mentioned earlier that the TAPCO was the lifeline, the thing that held us together. Well, that's the same thing. That was our bonding mechanism. And without it, it'd have been pretty hard to bond in the same way. To bond, you need some kind of a personal contact. And besides the business, there was a lot of personal, that type of personal stuff that made us very close.
Okay, so let's talk about well, let's say that in some ways you had some training early on as a young boy. There's a sort of story that Townley talks about Father Joe, that you learned to face up against overwhelming odds at an early age. Talk to me about how that may or may not have informed your experience.
I think when you say you face up to some hard times, the main thing I think it's teaching is you can survive it, that you can go on, that you're not automatically beat. A good place was that, like in wrestling or football. You know, you may get the living daylights beat out of you, and but that doesn't mean you don't show up at the next game. And I remember talking to a group of all my wrestlers, one of the coaches were there, and a bunch of football players. And I told them a story when I was a freshman. I hated this goddamn coach. He beat the crap out of me. He wanted me to come across the line demonstrating for the seniors, the varsity players, and I was just, you know, the dummy. And I thought I was doing that. And he chewed me out. I said, "Kid, come across the line or something." He really wanted me to charge across, and I'd just stand up and block. Well, the third time, I went charging across that line, and he laid in a body block that just laid me out. And I said, "Sam, I hate your guts." He was there. I said, "You hurt me so bad, mentally, physically, you name it, and I've hated you ever since then. But every time I was getting tortured, I thought of you, because like you knocked out, but I got up again like you told me to. Get up, kid." They could never beat me down that I wouldn't get back up. I think that might be a life lesson. It can get really bad, and there's no good answers. Like before, again, you wish you could come up with a rationale that you could avoid the torture. There are no good answers there. But what I learned through that and scouting and several other things was that you just get up, get ready for the next play. Can't call the shots. All you can do is get up and be ready to do it. And that's the way that's what I did over there.
Beautiful, wonderful, wonderful. And that's a lesson that you know, sports are played in lots of schools across the country. In the academies, sports have a deeper meaning, and you're putting your finger right on it. There are lessons, life lessons to be learned here about endeavor and persistence. Thank you. That was fantastic. What were the circumstances? Obviously, the formation of the Alcatraz separation. What were the circumstances that led up to that? And Talk to me about finding yourself at Alcatraz.
Well, I think they were looking for, quote, the leadership or the instigators. They think of leadership in a different way. They're commissars, you know, communists. They're the ones that run things and set policy, not necessarily the technical leaders. And they were after the people who had doing, because obviously they had moved a whole lot of people back into, we termed the Little Vegas portion of the overall Hanoi complex, prison complex. They had expanded it. They had a lot more rooms. Still mostly just people, maybe doubles, still some solos. But they were obviously organized and resisted them. And you know, you separate people, beat them down, you think you have them under your control, and they obviously did not. And so they went on a purge starting probably April timeframe of '67, pulling people out. They'll start with an excuse. They maybe caught you communicating. That's always an easy one. But progressed to really some pretty brutal torture, trying to find out who is giving the order, so to speak. And they went through Little Vegas. Geez, they must have tortured the hell out of, 30, 40 guys, trying to determine who these leaders were that were, in charge of the resistance. That's the same purge that I mentioned earlier that George and I had gone to, but then we'd been hauled off to the Dirty Bird, from which we escaped. After escaped, after beating them all kinds of other junk, we actually brought back to a very remote little corner in Little Vegas area called the Mint, where we were isolated on those cardboard bunks without legs and stocks and handcuffed behind our back. They had finally isolated who they thought were the leaders. And so October, I'm trying to think, about 27th, they hauled 11 people. Now, in the case of George and I, we weren't leaders. We were the bad guys that escaped, but we got dragged in with them. But they took out the 11 people that went to Alcatraz. And in fact, they had, of those 11, they certainly did have 6 or 8 of the real ringleaders. 1 or 2 of them might have got, kind of grabbed up a little bit by accident. And of course, George and I had nothing to do with the so-called, I don't think we did anyway. We were there because he escaped. But that's how they bundle up. And as much we always talk about the method, hey, you cut off the head, the next one stands up, keep on going. It actually, as it turned out, I found out many years later, it was pretty effective, because the resistance level dropped significantly after those Alcatraz guys were pulled out, and it never recouped until we got back.
Talk to me about CAG. You knew him pretty well. You served under him when you got out, and so you probably got a chance to know him pretty well.
CAG, Jim Stockdale. Obviously, he was a great guy. I loved him. But trying to talk about him a little bit more, objectively, I think he might have been one of those natural leaders. He certainly was there. All he needed was like the opportunity of the situation. And the number one thing that I can say about CAG, beyond any shadow of a doubt, was the concept that the leader sets the example. He never asked anybody to do anything that he would not do. And not just hypothetically, if I want you to suffer, I suffer first. He led the way. He never pushed the way. And that's a humongous trait and a leadership quality. That by itself will get you a lot of followers. He was also extremely smart. You say, well, people are smart, you got to be. Not really. You look around, when, people get ahead tend to be smart, I say like the top 25%. But the really smart people, the Mensa type of people, they're up in the top 5%, and that's where CAG was. The secret is, can they balance that very brilliant type of smarts with the common man? He tied it through philosophy. He was a student of philosophy. I would even say he was a philosopher. And that was one of the unique things. He would know his people, and then he would put those people in a job that was best for them, because then he knew he'd get the best possible performance out of them. And he was a master at doing that. And if there was a party or a grouping or a gathering, you could tell, at least I could tell when CAG was in the room. There's like a glow, or an inspiration, an energy level, and people just were aware of it. You know, he wasn't charismatic, but on one hand, he was without even being that way. He just struck that way. He was there, and his presence was felt. And I would say it never particularly went to his head. He cared about his people all the way through, every place I worked with him. But like I say, he was just really one of those strange epitomes of a great leader. He had the right little combinations of things that just made him exceptional.
I'm going to pause for 1 second because they're rolling the cart upstairs just until that noise stops. You doing okay? Do you need a little break? Or you
No, I'm okay for another half hour, I guess.
Okay. I can certainly, we'll take breaks here. You've been going almost an hour, so we can take a little break and then come back and get into it again?
Let's go another half hour. I'm not quite ready yet.
Okay.
The bladder dictates these things.
I understand. Trust me.
And I don't get much of a vote.
As my father-in-law said to me before he passed on, Carrie's dad, Patrick, at my age, I feel like I gotta take a piss while I'm pissing. Well, that's a beautiful, just stunning, actually, statement about CAG. And you were the youngest pilot shot down in the Vietnamese prison system. So it's fair to say you were a junior officer, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And yet you were in this Alcatraz with the most senior officers, correct?
Yep.
So what can you, in military leadership, they talk about great leadership, but they also talk about great followership. There are those who pull together with the dictates and the guidance of the leaders, and you were a disseminator of the word. You passed the word down the channel, so you got to see a bird's eye view of the Jerry Dentons and the Jim Stockdales and others who were formulating policy for others to follow. Speak to me about that.
Well, I'm trying to think back. Once I was talking to a huge audience of Marines, primarily enlisted at the Marine Ball party they were having. And I was going back and forth about that. To just what you said. They're great leaders, but you need great followers. They can't be great if you're not a good follower. You know, you can't be great if they're not a good leader. It's a two-way street. You know, you shouldn't be looking for an excuse to walk across the street so you don't have to salute the officer. But at the same time, the officer should remember that he's got to cross the street to help you and make sure you have what you need. And it's not a democracy, obviously. You don't get to vote one way or the other. But as a group, and I think this is what sometimes the seniors kind of forget, us young guys, we expect that leadership. And we do not accept it when we don't get it. We may have to in terms of, do we go and revolt? No, but one, you won't get the kind of quality work you want because you're leading poorly. You won't get that emotional or that bonding type effect that you might think of when you think of other great leaders who did have that bonding because of great leadership. But the young guys, they know what leadership is. They may not be able to give you a definition or tell you what school to go to, but if you talk to a lot of guys on a ship, in a squadron, whatever you want to do, and a team, and you say, is this guy a good leader? If it's anonymous, they'll tell you. Not going to get in trouble. But there's no doubt in their mind, they would unanimously, if you got them honest, would tell you if yes or no. And you say, well, what do you want? They want a good leader. And that's what I tapped into. I was part of it. I totally supported them, to the best of my physical ability anyway. And I think that filtered down to other JOs. And I've talked about since coming back, and to me that was a key thing. Yeah, you need good followers, but don't forget good followers expect good leadership.
You have such a wonderful way of expressing this. I really, really, this is gold. This is gold for this project. Alcatraz was a horrible experience. You went through. There are many, many the POWs who tell a similar tale. That it goes like this: that they're the flyboys, they're the Top Guns, they're doing their missions, coming back and having their coffee or a beer or whatever it is. They've got a whole cadre of people prepping their planes and doing everything else, and then one day suddenly they find themselves in a rice paddy with rifles facing them, and a whole new different reality and world happens. There's a stripping process, and many go through physical torture and travail to where some part of their self-understanding gets broken down. And there are things, as you're describing them, that you find. There is a famous description of a sequence of torture that you went through in isolation, and that you found over time the things that you would hold on to disassociate from the pain and the torture got less and less and less. Like you would start forgetting things that you. Can you talk to me about that experience? Because I think there's vital lessons in this.
That general thing, yes, it does happen. And how do you hold on when it's over a prolonged period of time? And it's one of the things you'll never find out until you're forced to live it. I don't think you can really think about it in advance. But in a certain respect, especially over prolonged stuff, and Alcatraz was like that just on a daily basis without a particular torture session going on. But it's like your whole body and your whole mind, your whole personality is on trial. And that mind and personality is part of the environment you came from. You can't be a great Boy Scout if you never heard of scouting. You can't be a great Buddhist monk if you've never heard of Buddhism. I mean, you take it any way, but I mean, you are made, so to speak, by your culture and the people around you. Well, the big ones for me was scouts, sports, and religion, faith. And this came out numerous times. And this one particular event that went on for, let's see, October, November, there's 3 months. That was excruciating. It was much a battle of mind over matter as it was physical pain and suffering. It ended up the thing that kept me going with Scouts. It got down to those 3 things, and I'd mentioned earlier about the football coach is the same type of thing, and Benedict takes the credit, get up kid, take the next shot, get ready for the next play. That got me through many, many issues over there at various times. But at this time, for some reason, it finally started to fade. And even my faith started to fade. And somebody said, how can you give up? I didn't give up on God. It wasn't the issue at all. But it got to the point you couldn't consciously format a thought, a prayer, a concept, even to say, God help me. The thing that held on that particular time was scouting and the Scout Oath. Somehow I was able to keep doing that. And toward the end, it was a humongous struggle to get through the Scout Oath. I mean, it would be like telling you to sit down and to take a 6-hour test to get certified for the law degree. I mean, it would take that much effort and energy just to say this one short paragraph. Both, again, mental as well as physical. And it got down, I couldn't do that. I got down, in the end, the only thing I could say was, on my honor, I'll do my best, which is the way the Scout Oath starts. I couldn't get any farther. And just to say those words could very well have taken me a minute. And I lived 1 minute at a time as I tried to force that phrase out of me again, because everything else had left. It just wasn't there anymore. And obviously, it was a tremendous impact on me, and usually I only share this with Scouts because it's not trying to put down anything else, but in this particular event, this horrendous duress, and everything I had and my own self-awareness was at stake. The thing that kept me going until they gave up first was Scouts. And you say I've been very indebted to Scouts ever since, and I've worked with them and supported them ever since, because I have said they saved my life. And that probably still was probably the worst event I've had over there, and the thing that gives me the most nightmares and causes of, PTSD attacks and stuff, is that 3 months, what we call holding up the wall. So,
Speak to me about, if you would, sir, on my honor, I will do my best. What do those words mean?
just what they said, and if you put it together, I'm going to do my best to do my duty to God and my country. For a long time, I could get that far. Because that also feeds later into the Scout Law, to God and to country, two things. To obey the Scout Law, which is a 12-point Scout, to help other people at all times. The standard motto of Scouting, keep myself physically strong, mentally awake, and morally straight. So you piece together not trying to compare religions and Scouts or anything, but you think like the term the Alpha, all the things that are wrapped up into it. I mean, if you wanted to, you could have a 10-hour sermon just breaking the pieces apart. So much was put in one. The Scout Oath was like that. It was well thought out. And what did it mean? So if you had time to think about it, you say, well, what about Scout Law? George, tell me about the 12 points. And I could go down to 12 points and elaborate on each one of them for 5 minutes or 15 minutes. But in the end, you say it all when you say, on my honor, I'll do my best to do my duty to God and my country. What does that not cover? Especially for a soldier or military person. And it finally got down, on my honor, I'll do my best to do my duty. I couldn't get the God and country part anymore. You're still saying just about everything. And in final analysis, as a human being, soldier, whoever you are, what more can you ask than saying, on my honor, I'll do my best? And that's the only thing I had to ask myself later in life, and we talked about Git Phillips, is did I do my best? I'm not saying did I succeed, did I win, did I get tortured, did I resist, no, did I do my best? And as long as I can feel that I did my best, nothing else counts.
You are a really impressive human being. I really get what you're saying. I think what we'll do is take a break.
Okay?
Use the restroom, and we've got neighbors who moved in next door. We've got to talk to them about trying to get them to not talk so loud. Let me get the microphone off you. Hold on, let me cut camera.
Should we do a chill marker, just for the heck of it?
Yeah, let's,
I think that's laying right over there somewhere. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, I got it. You gonna do it?
Okay. This is Coker interview and tail slate.
Yeah, go ahead.
Good.
Got it. Okay. I'm
Let
gonna
me
cut my
get
camera.
you. Let me cut camera.